Good morning, London. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, especially when the sun has his hat on outside. Always nice to be back in town. We will be discussing today future-proofing the digital asset industry, so ensuring growth amidst regulatory uncertainty. I'm Emma Joyce. I'm the CEO of GBBC Digital Finance. Last year, we merged with the Global Blockchain Business Council, and we're now the largest digital asset and blockchain association in the world. And we engage globally around the world with different regulators, policymakers, and industry working towards that regulatory certainty. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with these amazing panelists today. We've already been having a great conversation for quite a while upstairs, actually, so I'm sure this is going to be a thrilling discussion. I'd like to ask my panelists to introduce themselves today and tell you a little bit about them. If we could start with Lisa, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Dr. Lisa Cameron. I'm an MP in the House of Commons, and I have the privilege of starting up and chairing the all-party parliamentary group for cryptocurrency and digital assets in the Parliament. So I've been doing that work now for 2 years. You've all kept me extremely busy. It's a fast-paced sector, and we continue to upskill ourselves in the Parliament to make sure that we can do this dynamic sector justice moving forward.
Hi, I'm Jeff Horowitz. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Bitgo, one of the largest institutional custodians. Been around 11 years now, and excited to be here and to talk about regulation and what we're doing well and what we're not doing well.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here today. I'm JB Graftio. I'm the CEO of Bitstamp. We have been in the crypto space for more than 12 years, and very happy to share more on our journey, especially around regulation.
So, first question for today. How can governments around the world not only address the risks that digital assets can present, but also really harness the potential from digital assets and the underlying technologies? How do you think governments are working to manage those two questions? Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to go first if you. I mean, really what we've had to do in Parliament is to get ourselves up to pace with this industry and this sector. So working across the House of Commons and the House of Lords, when I started, it was very much with a consumer protection focus, which remains at the core of the work we're doing in the Parliament. I had a constituent contact me, which of course is where all of our work emanates from, our constituents who'd experienced a rug pull scam. And at that point in time, we weren't really doing anything in the Parliament. There had been no debates. There were very few questions. But we looked at what was happening across the UK, and millions of people were engaged in the sector. So we knew that there was no going back, that this sector is here to stay, and that actually what we need to do is manage the consumer risks, put the regulation in place, and harness the potential. Because when we looked at this industry very closely with the blockchain technological advancements, we felt we really have a digital generation ahead, and this is like a new industrial revolution, but it's going to be more than industry. It's going to be culture and art, sports, etc. So we need to get ahead of it, and we want the UK to be at the helm of this moving forward. So we've really been doing so much work to bring industry, to bring regulators and legislators together, and consumers to make sure that we square the circle and take this work ahead.
Thank you, Lisa. Jean-Baptiste, we talk in the title of this panel about regulatory uncertainty, but in Europe with MiCA, are we more in the realms of certainty than uncertainty now? How do European companies feel?
Yes, I would say, if you take into account the regulatory landscape today in Europe, it's very, very complex. It's very fragmented as well. Each country has its own approach on crypto today, which means that for crypto operator, you need to apply for a VASP in some countries, in some type of other licenses in other countries, and in some other countries in Europe, you don't need to have any registration to operate. So as a crypto operator, we need to navigate around this regulatory transition, if I can say. I would call that regulatory patchwork because of the complexity, because of the fragmentation, and it's extremely expensive also to maintain. Which means for us, essentially, MiCA is very important so that we can establish a level playing field across Europe, essentially, to have clear rules for accessing crypto for crypto asset service providers. We feel also that MiCA is important to increase consumer protection, which is the key, essentially, to drive some level of adoption for consumers to enter the crypto space. So what we see in MiCA, essentially, is establishing level playing field, increase consumer protection, and basically helping firms to navigate around the market, to avoid the complexity that we are experiencing today, to avoid the fragmentation that we are experiencing today. And ultimately, that will help us also to reduce our cost in terms of legal fees, in terms of regulatory fees that we are experiencing today to stay in compliance. The key part as well is that with the freedom to provide services in the EU, you will establish your entity in one country, get MiCA, and then you can passport across all EU member states, which is extremely compelling to drive the business, essentially. And the other point is that the rules in terms of governance, risk management, compliance, will be there, which means that it will be clearer, at least in that region, to stay in compliance versus potentially the US, where there are litigation, there are court cases to try to drive some level of clarity in the regulatory landscape. So for us, from a Bitstamp point of view, we are very supportive of MiCA, essentially, for the reasons I just mentioned, really to try to establish that level playing field and be in an ecosystem where, if the rules are clear, that will drive adoption for consumers, but also essentially institutional players entering the space.
So a positive for industry. Jeff, Jean-Baptiste talked briefly there about the US. A slightly different approach happening now in the US. Do we have a view as to what the US thinks of other frameworks that are happening around the world? And is there a risk on the US not having these frameworks in place soon?
Absolutely. I think we've recognized that we're far behind many other jurisdictions, whether that's MiCA in Europe or Dubai or Singapore, who've come up with a framework. We're still grappling internally. Our legislators write the law, our regulators manage and enforce those regulations, and some of those think that our existing rule book works just fine. And I disagree. I think we have a new innovation, we have this peer-to-peer technology, and our rule book needs to be modernized. I've been in crypto for 6 years. We're still having the same conversations over who has jurisdiction to bring enforcement cases rather than who can actually answer some questions. And what's resulted is we are now in the courts because neither our legislators can pass a framework and our regulators won't answer questions. So we have no choice but to go to the courts, and that does nobody any good. Our investors, our consumers still don't have the protections they need, and we have lost the innovation battle. I think we were one of the first countries to get heavily involved in crypto, and it could have been ours to win, and now we're at the point where, while we're not leaving the US, we are hanging our flags, working on our license in Dubai, because they've taken a very practical approach. They're not going to spend 3 years deciding what's a security and what's a commodity. They've taken 6 rule books and said, what are the risks that we need to address in each of these rule books? That's a common sense approach. We have some principal regulation with the CFTC, but we don't have it like the UK as a backbone. And I am worried, from being a US citizen, that we are losing that innovation battle. There are risks we need to address, but are we going to throw it all out and throw out all the innovation that it can bring?
Thank you. We may come back to that, actually, because it's a very interesting, I think, topic in this conversation. But Lisa, going back a little bit to MiCA, obviously the UK is progressing certain regulatory initiatives. How does that compare to MiCA? And can you talk us a little bit through what the UK is doing at the moment, please?
Yeah. I mean, we started off, as I say, upskilling ourselves. So we had lots of industry come to speak to us. We had round tables in the Parliament. We really started from scratch. So we had some meetings where people were talking about fiat, and some of the members of the House of Lords were saying, why are we talking about cars? Isn't this about finance? So, you know, we really had to bring ourselves on quite at rapid pace there from that point of view. But from that point, we have done about 18 months now of education in the Parliament. We've had a number of inquiry reports. We've had bills moving through the House. The next stage of our group, and we want everyone who's interested to get in touch with the All-Party Parliamentary Group, because it's your group as much as it is mine. The next stage is to look at international best practice. So we've been to Zug. We've been speaking to legislators there. We've been arranging to go to Paris and Brussels, and we're thinking also about engaging with Singapore and with Dubai. And we want to look at what is the international best practice and where can the UK take a bespoke approach that fits for the framework that we want to set here. But only when we can look at that, because there's going to be, I think, have to be some sort of interoperability as well globally, and a set of standards as well that overarches things, although different jurisdictions will do their own thing to some degree. So, but those are the sort of elements we're working on, what can we pull to the UK? We're not generally the first mover, so we're pleased that MiCA's there, and we can look at that and then look at what we want to adopt and where we can kind of have that bespoke approach for competitiveness in the UK.
That's really interesting, thank you. So you're looking, you know, further than just MiCA, because I think many were waiting to see if the UK would just copy MiCA, or it's interesting to see, you know, we think government...
No, I don't think there's going to be any copying of MiCA, but obviously where things are working, then you don't, you know,
no, exactly.
the UK doesn't want to invent something entirely new, but we have to have what fits here, you know, and it's a bit like having something bespoke, but also with a competitive edge. And it's, you know, is it MiCA, is it MICA, potatoes, potatoes, you know, we all have different impressions. So we're learning about it, and we're pleased it's there, and we feel that it's a great step. And I actually had a look at some research that showed that not just is MiCA good for consumers, for protection, but also when you have that clarity, it brings investment. So a lot of investment is now moving to the EU because of MiCA. So I think they're doing a great job. We want to learn from that, and also to create our own bespoke system here.
Jeff, just going back to you very briefly, obviously I know you spoke about what's happening in the US, but obviously we hear Lisa saying that the UK is looking further afield. I have to say I'm a teeny bit more positive than you on the US, only because I think the US has always been such a leader in innovation. I can't believe that they're not going to quickly get it together and try and continue to be a leader in this space. Do you think those in power in the US are looking abroad, are looking closely at what's happening in Singapore, in UAE, in Europe, and thinking about trying to pick out the parts from those frameworks that they like?
To an extent. Crypto's become very politicized. You know, we're fighting between Republicans and Democrats. We did make some progress. We had a market structure bill make it through the House Financial Services Committee and our Ag Committee. It now goes to the full House before it goes to the Senate. Whether it will pass under our current regime, I don't know. But I do like how MiCA took a look at, like, we can't get everything in one bill, right? So they've left off DeFi and some of the thornier issues, but at least they have a starting process. I hope that that's where we get. And maybe some smaller bills, whether it's a stablecoin bill or market structure, that we get some clarity while we work around the edges of the other, you know, thornier issues. Are we afraid, or are we learning how others are doing it? Absolutely. I just don't know if there's the political will in this current administration to take that on and actually make real progress.
Okay, so a lot to wait and find out.
Yep.
Thank you. As we look back on the events of last year, how do we think companies are really ensuring that they have the right compliance and governance strategies in place? Jean-Baptiste, could I start with you, please?
Sure. So I think what happened last year is essentially around the lack of governance, risk management, and compliance from some of the operators that do not exist anymore today. So the key for us is to reassure our customers, essentially, and our regulators and partners that we have been in a space for 12 years now. We have a portfolio of 53 licenses in the world. Compliance first, regulatory first, security first. This is really the message we try to convey. Our financial statements are audited by a Big Four since now 2016. And 1/3 of our excellent employees are working in legal and compliance and regulatory and risk management. So we really want to emphasize that it is important, regulatory and governance and risk management are very, very important. And Mika will essentially also reinforce that, that point. When you get a license, you have to accommodate a set of controls and governance and risk management. So we look at, the last 12 months, essentially it's a lack of governance, a lack of, probably audits, a lack of transparency, and to re-emphasize to the market, I think the best actors today, like us, for instance, we are really emphasizing on transparency, proof of reserve, risk management, governance, really to give the maximum comfort to our existing clients, to give the comfort also to our regulators. And what we have seen, especially for us, is that we have tripled our market shares, in the last 12 months. So probably regulatory compliance was not really sexy, if I can say, more than a year ago, but it's becoming, the key of the success in that market today. Transparency and regulatory and security.
Thank you. Jeff, would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, on the eve of the FTX, trial today, right? There were a lot of lessons learned, but it wasn't a crypto failure, right? This was risk management. It was poor governance. It was a bad market structure of having an exchange also be a custodian. The New York Stock Exchange is not a custodian. And so we need to get those, basic principles of separation of duties into regulation and into law. But a lot of the collapses we had were fundamental failures just on risk management. And I think we're doing a better job now than we did then, but could we avoided all those problems if we had self-regulated ourselves and done the right things? I think our industry would be farther along. I think we've taken 2 steps back to go 1 forward.
Thank you. Lisa, should governments and industry be working together and in sync on this issue? And do you think they are?
I think we're getting much better at it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, definitely over the past year. In fact, actually, the upheaval in this industry, in your industry, is nothing compared to the upheaval in the Parliament. I've had 3 prime ministers in the last year, so we've been grappling with our changes too. But I think we have more stability now. We have been working across government with industry, with consumers, with the regulator. The regulator definitely needs more support, we've highlighted that in our inquiry report, that we feel there needs to be much more support put there, because we need to have basic things to be happening, and we're highlighting these to government all the time in questions, in debates, like opening a bank account, still very difficult in the UK for companies. Basic things like getting a license, taking a very long time. Very few companies have made that. So we need to, if we're going to be a crypto hub, which is what Prime Minister Sunak has said his aspiration is for the UK, and we want to work cross-party to achieve that. If we want that to happen, we need to actually tackle not just the sort of high-level policy stuff, but the basic things that you need to do to run a company here as well, like opening bank accounts, etc., giving the FCA many more tools and much more support in order to get their job done in a more streamlined way. So I think we've made a huge amount of progress. The reason I come to these events, and thank you for inviting me, is to have that link with industry, because I think that's just very key in order to get a what works principles going in the Parliament. And as I said, we've been on our learning curve, but only with your help are we getting there. And with such a fast-moving, dynamic industry, we need to have your engagement in order to make this work for the UK.
Thank you. And I have to say, I definitely see that myself too. I really see, and not just UK regulators, but we talk globally to regulators everywhere, and we see that level of engagement has really picked up the pace this year. Jean-Baptiste, do you see that in Europe as well? Are you seeing industry and government?
Yeah, I would say, the ecosystem is less than 15 years old today. So of course it takes time, to build and to deploy a set of controls to engage with legislators and regulators and try to educate on our ecosystem. That takes a lot of time. I used to work in e-money business in the past, and it took ages, to get, e-money directive, payment service directive. So we are experiencing, something very similar with crypto. So I think what we are living today is not unusual. It's a lot of engagement and education, and I would say, some level of influence to try to share our knowledge, the way we are running the business, so that we basically try to align or go in a direction where the regulation is a smart regulation, essentially. So it's not a surprise. I mean, if we look at the ecosystem, it's like 15 years today. There has been a transitional regime with the VASP in different countries, which is a first step. MiCA is probably the second one, and I'm sure there will be a MiCA 2 in the future, essentially in Europe. But of course, we see the same in Singapore. We see the same in the UK, where the regulatory landscape is evolving. And it takes time, but it's also up to us, private sector, to engage with legislators, regulators, working group, and really share our knowledge to make the dialogue the most effective, to build and establish a proper set of regulation. And clarity is the key for us in our market.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Thank you. Does anyone have a view on AI and how, I guess it's a lot, we hear about it all the time in the news. I know it's a very hot topic, and there's a real focus on governance and regulation for AI. How do we think this may impact the world of digital assets?
I mean, I can talk about what's happened in the Parliament. We have a new AI metaverse all-party group that people can be in touch with. I think it's all very linked. We actually had the Children's Parliament come to speak to us about AI developments, and we had lots of different organizations there. One of the first questions was, put your hand up if you understand the metaverse and AI. All the children, very few MPs, very few members of the House of Lords. So we have this digital generation that's happening that we are learning from, the children and the young people. And I think, jobs of the future is my next debate in the Parliament, digitalisation and jobs of the future. And I think we really have to make sure that we give opportunities to young people, but also for people who have been in industries who want to switch and reskill, because this is going to be transformational, and we clearly have a lot of work to do to understand it fully. So yes, we also have that consumer protection part, and the children said to us, they're very savvy, they said, we don't want to be doing this all day, every day. We don't want to live in a virtual world, but this will change our education. We could be at the heart of a volcano experiencing it. We could be, back in history with Henry VIII having our head cut off as one of his wives. We could do all these things, understanding things, but we don't want to do it all the time because it's not good for our health. And they said very clearly, you need to make it safe. So that's our tasks moving ahead in the Parliament.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I've just noticed, I haven't been looking at the questions, but we do have questions from the audience. So let's take one. I think we have covered this a little, but we have one question, which is, isn't the lack of standardization of regulations across different jurisdictions a concern for the industry? Will we move towards such direction in the future? Does anyone have any views on that?
Sure, go
I can go first.
Is it a concern? Yes, because I fear that some will go to the path of least resistance, try to go to the jurisdiction where you're going to get a license quickly. Our biggest challenge is, even within our own jurisdictions, whether it's Europe or the UK or the US, we haven't come to a standardization, let alone at a global level. And the travel rule being one of those regulations out there that you need global coordination for that travel rule to actually work. FATF came out and set some standards that you need to share this information, but we haven't tackled what the definitions are, so how can we actually share that information? So it is a concern, but I think it's really up to our own jurisdictions first to lay out that framework that we're comfortable with, and then we could figure this out on a global scale.
Yeah. Jean-Baptiste?
So much. I think, this is a concern. I think for us, the crypto dream would be one set of regulation globally, but of course that's not something we would be exploring. Nevertheless, I think, what is important is we have some, let's say, global standards or market practices when it comes to, for instance, KYC, travel rule, where we try to design a global scheme for crypto operators, which is good. The complexity here is, as long as the regulatory landscape is fragmented, US, Europe, UK, Singapore, what it implies is, additional cost, additional complexity, additional, I would say, almost lack of clarity, and it's not really helpful for us to navigate around the regulatory landscape. Nevertheless, as mentioned earlier, I think our job essentially is really as private sector to engage with regulators everywhere in the world and try to build a more standardized or uniform landscape. And of course, it takes time. Each country or each region has probably a different approach on crypto as well. But nevertheless, the goal for us would be to minimize, the key differences across the different regions for crypto. And I think UK and Europe is essentially the same, spirit. In the US, I think we need to wait probably a couple of years to get more clarity on the landscape. And I think Singapore, for instance, is a good place to make business. The spirit is very similar to Europe, so that we see some level of harmonization also between the two regions there.
Absolutely, and we've seen recently the FSB's recommendations. We see organisations like IOSCO bringing many different players in the industry together, which I think is very positive, and I see a lot of collaboration in the industry, regardless of where a company is based. So I think that's very encouraging. One thing that I think you touched on slightly in talking about this new any new regulation and the costs that it's going to incur, does it put smaller startups, in a difficult position? Are the bigger, more powerful companies in a much better position, and how do we ensure that innovation still thrives?
Great question. I think, looking at MiCA in Europe, for instance, my gut feeling is that the entry barriers will be pretty high for, small companies with limited financial capabilities to make it happen. Why? Because when you get a MiCA license in the future, you need to have robust compliance, risk management, essentially, audit capabilities, strong management in place. And obviously, for small startups, it might be hard, to get to that point. My gut feeling is that we would see probably more consolidation in the ecosystem for that reason, essentially, because the cost of regulation is expensive, which means that I see, more global actors with large financial capabilities, potentially to get under their umbrella, some startups willing to enter the crypto space. That's probably how I look at the ecosystem. So I think the short answer is that entry barriers might be high to enter the crypto market in the future.
Thank you. And Lisa, do you ever hear from any of the smaller startups at all?
Yes, I do. I hear from lots of different sizes of organisation. I just think it's really fundamental for the UK and actually across the world globally. That this is like a new industrial revolution. We need to have these entrepreneurs and innovators, and we need to make sure we link it to research, university courses, development, but that we give people the impetus and the funding and the support to come forward and to be those entrepreneurs of the future, because I think with the technological advancements, it's going to be really key for the future of our industry as a whole, that we have a leadership position And I think only with that investment and support to help people start up and scale up can we do that. So I wouldn't like to see it being overly burdensome for companies and people who want to just develop their ideas and be inspirational for this country, because those are the people we need. We need you going forward, and it's our job to make sure that you have a place at the table, and that we listen to your concerns, and that we help to enable you to contribute, because I think that's going to be what is at the cornerstone of what I would call digital Britain moving forward.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left, so we've got time for one more question, which is, end customers and financial institutions are looking for trust. How do you think security and custody of digital assets will help this? And how long will it take? We haven't covered custody, actually. Jeff, would you mind?
Sure. I think that's a great question. We're a qualified custodian in the US, which means we're regulated. We're regulated at the state level in South Dakota and in New York. And I think investors are looking for someone that they can trust. Who gets examined? What rule books do you follow? There's definitely room for self-custody, but when you're talking about billions of assets, I think you want to outsource that to a professional firm. FTX was an example of an exchange, not a custodian, that custodies assets online and didn't have all the right risk management or didn't have all the right security controls. So I think we're there. There are a lot of custodial players that have taken it seriously, that have spent the money that JB was talking about on security, on controls, on compliance and legal, to make you feel that your assets are secure and that they're going to be there when you need it. I think the lack of regulation and some of the lending that we were allowed and some of the kind of 100x that we experienced didn't go well for those custodians that didn't follow the rule books that we're used to in traditional markets.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Big thank you to Lisa, Jeff, and Jean-Baptiste for joining me on stage today, and I do hope you'll enjoy the rest of the day.